You can turn on the projector now. I got. Started now. It is 2 p.m. There are two sessions going on. In Peninsula 2, down the hallway, is a session on the Pictured Rocks Lakeshore and Upper Peninsula tourism. But the session here today is, in this room, is on Native American intergenerational trauma. So what I'd like to do is introduce you to three young people who are students here at NMU. And I'll introduce them each individually, though they're going to tell you their life stories, I hope, as a part of this. These three students all played a role in the current exhibit that we have at the Beaumere Center on what we call the Seventh Fire. And if you want to know what that's all about, please go see the exhibition. But a portion of that exhibition is on intergenerational trauma. We have a video about the concept, which many people do not seem to understand very well. And I certainly didn't understand the term very well before I started working on projects like this over the years. And I've really come to know it much better. So on my far right is Yrsa Peterson, who's from Bayfield, Wisconsin. And she is a senior here at Northern, studying music and what is your minor is Spanish, correct? And then to her left is Bazile Panek, who is a student in Native American Studies, and also, are you in business as well? All right, fantastic. And to his left is Kateri Phillips, who is you're a freshman this year, correct? You're a sophomore. They're a freshman for some reason. And they're going to tell you about their experience. They're all students in the Center for Native American Studies as well, who are taking courses there and are involved with the Native American Student Association here at Northern. And I've asked them each to make kind of an opening statement about their, about intergenerational trauma in their lives and from their own perspectives and their own backgrounds, and then I'll ask them some questions after that. So why don't we start on the far right with Yrsa.
Ani kena Yrsa Anwatin Indigenicas Gawabiganikag Nindunjaba Makwanindudem. Hello everyone, my name is Yrsa Anwatin. Anwatin is Ojibwemoin. It means the water is calm. It was a name that my mother gave me. It's not the usual spirit name that many Ojibwe people will get from an elder. My family is from White Earth, Minnesota, Gawababiganikag, but I actually grew up near Misquabikong or Red Cliff, which is the reservation near Bayfield, and I belong to the Bear Clan. My mother is Native, and my whole family comes from either White Earth or Mille Lacs bands of Ojibwe peoples. But I am rather estranged, and I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I'm very white passing. I have pale skin. I have red hair. I don't fit the phenotype of being Native American. But I grew up learning a lot of traditional medicine and food teachings and foraging techniques with my mother. So I've been immersed within Ojibwe culture and language as well from a very young age. My mother studied Ojibwemoin and the nutritive and medicinal properties of indigenous flora at the University of Minnesota when she was a young person. So I have the benefit of this great fount of culture and knowledge nearby me in my life. But not everybody, not all Native people have that. And I think that one of the greatest ways that I experience intergenerational trauma in my life is the fact that I'm estranged from my family and my tribe. And it's hard for me to reconnect. I have the benefit of having this wonderful mother who is very connected with our culture and who strives to make me comfortable in being the same. And I think that the fact that I am sitting here talking to you guys today is an achievement for me. And she would be very proud of me. But I think that reconnecting with our culture and reclaiming our culture is something that is very hard for a lot of people in our generation and something that really exacerbates a lot of the even harder aspects of intergenerational trauma. A lot of times when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we talk about things like alcoholism and drug use and these patterns that were introduced to us during early times and even modern times of colonization that our families and tribes are still working to get through. And on top of that, we have this huge body of healing knowledge and culture that we should be able to tap into, that there are these barriers keeping us from doing so. For me, it's my whiteness and the fact that my family lives off reservation. I'm not able to be a tribal member because my tribe is blood quantum. I have to prove how native I am through the amount of native blood that I hold. So not only do we have these patterns and habits that have been taught to us, kind of, I would say, over generations and generations, but the tools that can help us heal from those things are oftentimes cut off, like they have been for me. So that is a little bit of background with my experience of being Native and how I experience intergenerational trauma. I'll hand it off to Bazile.
Buju Nindinwe Magnadog Minwa Nich Bamada Sajig. I said, hello, all of my relatives. All my relatives is Nindinwe Magnadog. And then Minwa Nij Bamada Sajig. Nij Bamada Sajig is my friends. So you all are my friends now, whether you like it or not. Minugi Jigabo Indigena Kaz, Mesquabi Kang Indunjba, Megazine Dodame, Niwi Wanishkwe Tagos, Kege Bungi Niwi a Kid. Niwi Wanishkwe Tagos, I'm going to humbly interrupt and speak, and truly I'm only going to say a little bit. My name is Bazile Panek. I'm a senior studying Native American Studies here at NMU. I have minors in sustainability and entrepreneurship. I have the honor to serve as the current president of the Native American Student Association. I'm involved in other diversity, equity, and inclusion issues and opportunities on campus. So I grew up on the Red Cliff Reservation, the American Indian tribe that I am a tribal member of. I grew up on that reservation there. Growing up on a reservation obviously has exposed me to what intergenerational trauma looks like for us as Native people. For me, it looked like familial problems with alcoholism and drug use and suicide as well. And that's what intergenerational trauma has looked like for me. I'm super honored that I have had the opportunity to have parents who have been heavily involved with our culture, language, and history. Culture being playing traditional games like lacrosse or attending ceremonies like a big drum ceremony, or language, like speaking the language a little bit. My dad speaks a lot of the language. And history, studying, being in the locations where all of our treaties were negotiated between the Chippewa and the United States. I've been honored to have that access to history and stand on those grounds that my ancestors stood on and negotiated those treaties and ceded thousands and thousands of areas of land. So I think that being able to do that has both exposed me to intergenerational trauma as well as intergenerational resiliency. As Professor April Lindola says, I think that intergenerational trauma began with first contact with the colonizers back in the 1600s around this Great Lakes area. So I think that's when the trauma began. That's when colonizers brought alcohol to the natives and fed them alcohol while we were negotiating these big treaties. And they coerced them, they lied to them during those negotiations. So I think that's where trauma began. I'll also acknowledge that resiliency began at that time as well. I don't think we give enough credit to those ancestors that were negotiating treaties at that time. They were they were very, very intelligent in what they were doing during those negotiations. They thought of me when they were doing those negotiations. They knew about mineral rights before that had been exposed to, I guess, before that was known widely as mineral rights. And in the treaties, they made sure that they kept the mineral rights of the land. Obviously, that hasn't been dealt with well or has been misconstrued, but things like that, where they reserved mineral rights. They knew what they were doing with ceding thousands of areas of land. They were very intelligent. They were strong negotiators. They were strong orators. So I think that history is where intergenerational trauma began, but that is also where intergenerational resiliency began. Miigwech, thank you. Misa you, that's all I'm going to say for right now, at least.
Anin, Kateri, mina gete ya indigenous, Mbish mina chiguan dodam, bodewad min dao, Chishibanyak and the Bandaguas, Miyagi and the Shnabag ki, Dojbia. Hello, you all. My name is Kateri Phillips. I am Potawatomi. I'm Water and Thunder Clan, and I am from Oklahoma. So, when I think of like, what is it? And all I could think of is resiliency now, but intergenerational trauma. I always think about just like the story of how my people even got to Oklahoma to begin with. So I come from like a band of Potawatomi people who are from like Oklahoma, but originally from this area. So Potawatomi people are like all the way to Canada, literally all the way down to Mexico. And I never really understood that as a kid, and I never really understood like intergenerational trauma either until like now. I'm finally putting pieces together because it's really hard to like lay that all out for a kid because it's so much like history. So near like the 1800s, I have two sides of Potawatomi family. One side was from literally here in this area, and one side is from the Illinois area. And during that time, they were removing Potawatomi people from their land. And it was called the Trail of Death. So a lot of people talk about the Trail of Tears, and that was a terrible tragedy from the Cherokee Nation. The Trail of Death, a similar thing happened to my people. So they marched us all the way from up here, Wisconsin, all the way down into Kansas. They did it up here, and also my family in Illinois are marched down all the way down into Kansas. And so like there's like a couple of nations up in Canada who they weren't like removed all the way down. And then there's still a nation here in the UP, they're called Hannahville. And then there's a nation in Wisconsin. There's still a nation in Illinois, a nation in Kansas. And then my people were the like most south federally recognized Potawatomi tribe. And we're called the Citizen Band. We call ourselves the Shishibanyak for duck people because we just kept on following like the other natives down into Oklahoma. And so like we got our little piece there. And I also sang Mexico because some of us literally, we didn't stop in Oklahoma. Some of us kept on going down like into Mexico. And so there's like actual Potawatomi, and we're also really connected with Kickapoo people. So it's pretty wild. And so we started this move up here into Michigan, how I ended up here today, because of the language. We were like, my family really wanted to reconnect with that because we lost that during the boarding school time. My great-grandma was a fluent speaker, and we didn't know until she was really old. But she would speak to my oldest sister. And so my oldest sister has memories of having conversations with her in Anishinaabemowin that my great-grandma never shared with anybody else. That was like almost unique to her and my older sister. And so my older sister reinstilled like a fire in the entire family of bringing back the language. When I was a baby, she would speak to me in nothing but Anishinaabemowin. And that actually ended up being some of my first words. I would say, "Nonek niabo," like, I need more milk or something. And I'd be speaking in Anishinaabemowin, and my mom didn't know what I was saying. She'd be like, Christy, Christy, what is she saying? And so this like whole new fire and stuff was greenlit with like the language. Bringing the culture back, my mom was a big reason for that. She's biracial. I have a white grandfather and then a native grandmother. And so my mom felt a little bit of a disconnect, but loved the culture so much. She loved all of her friends who are like native. She loved her mother and the culture and all of that. And she wanted to bring that back for us, for her kids. And so she made that a big deal for us to like start reconnecting with the language and culture and all of that. And I ended up like being raised in Chibaquaz. We used to be super Catholic because of the boarding school time. We gravitated towards that. But when my mother started doing the whole shift, we started going to more cultural things. And so I was raised in nothing but Chibaquaz. Well, Chibaquaz are feasts. So like for the 4 seasons, we'll have a feast for like our ancestors who are in between and they're like hungry. So we give them food. We set a fire for them. And that's all I've known culturally. And like religious, I don't call that really religious in my head. That's not what that is. But that's the only thing I've had. And so all my siblings know like Catholicism, but I don't understand that because that's the only thing I've ever known. And so it's pretty interesting, like moving up here and then putting all the pieces as to why I am the reason I am. And I've only been able to do that now. And that is because of like the intergenerational trauma of like not being told just straight out. Because even for my parents or my grandparents, even they, like, I feel like had a hard time putting those words and pieces together of how we got to where we are today. Because it all happened so fast. Like the 1800s from now, like that seems like a long, long time, but it's not. It's not a long time. It's actually a really short amount of time. Like it was my great-great-great-great-grandfather who was removed and remembers. And we have stories in our family of the land we lived on when we were up here. So it's actually like a really short amount of time. So it's a lot to unpack. And it's kind of amazing that I've got the time specifically in my life, which is kind of unique to me because my siblings had to fight into going to college, to doing all that on their own, and then finding the balance of like religion and going back to the teachings. And I just got to follow them. So I've specifically got the time, like especially for my age, to look back on all of mine, like intergenerational trauma and what parts are so resilient about my family and how we got to where we are. So maybe I went on a tangent, but that's a little statement about me and my life story.
Thank you. Thank you. That was all fantastic. I don't think mine's on number 5. There we go. So my first question for you folks, and you can take turns on this. Kateri's already touched on it, and that is the boarding schools. In our exhibit, we focused a lot of the history and talked about the boarding schools because it's an era that a lot of people who are outside of the Native communities oftentimes don't understand, don't actually know what happened. For your communities, what was the impact and your own families, from your knowledge, which contributes to this idea of intergenerational trauma?
Cool. So boarding schools. My great-great-grandma on my dad's side went to a boarding school in Wisconsin. So familial history right away there. My great-great-grandma, she's still alive today. She's experiencing dementia right now, so she doesn't remember much, but for a story to understand this, we brought her back to some ceremonial grounds, and before then, she wasn't remembering much, but the second we stepped on those ceremonial grounds, she started to remember and tell these stories about her childhood and experiencing those ceremonies with her mom. She remembered when her mom brought her there. And then she also started to remember the boarding schools, and that kind of got emotional for her as those memories started to flood back. So familial connections to boarding schools. The goal for boarding schools, and hopefully some of you have heard this phrase before, but Richard Henry Pratt said the the goal of boarding schools was to kill the Indian and save the man. So kill the Indian spirit inside of somebody and save the man so that they can participate in Western culture and economy and become good employees and workers and customers and spenders. So kill the Indian spirit, solve our Indian problem that apparently we still have in the United States, and save the man. And so she dealt with boarding schools. There's two sides of boarding schools, I think, sometimes that should be identified. One is that there were these horrible things that were happening. People were shoved together in this school. The first thing that they did in those schools was the second that they got in the school, their hair was cut. You can see that I have long hair. It's not braided because I'm bad at braiding it. So they cut their hair, and the hair was a part of them. It's for us, we know it as like it carries all of our knowledge, and it connects us closer to the ground, our head closer to the ground, so we're more grounded to our Mother Earth. So they cut their hair, and that was there's actually been another story about hair. There was actually a time in World War II where they had some Navajo soldiers that had long hair, and they were known as great warriors, and they could track so well, and the Army ended up recruiting them because they saw their experience and what they were able to do. But in order to join the Army, they had to cut their hair off, and the second that they cut their hair off, those Navajo people, they were basically useless. They couldn't function in that environment. They couldn't track anymore. And I do think that that's because their hair was cut and they lost that power. So that's what happened in those boarding schools. They cut their hair off in order to make them look like a white man. They took all of their their traditional clothes and gave them different clothes to fit the white man's idea of what a man looks like, killing the Indian, cutting their hair off, giving them different clothes, and gave them a white name. They kind of picked a name off of the board and were given a white name, and then they were told never to speak the Ojibwe language again. An example that carries today with the trauma aspect, sometimes if anyone were ever to speak part of their Indian tongue, ivory soap was shoved in their mouth to clean out the Indianness or the bad language or whatever. So that was one aspect of trauma, but my great-great-grandma, there's also something else to identify with boarding schools that I think speaks to our resilience as Native people. Here at this point, there were many different nations that were gathering together in this school at one time, and they started to share languages and share histories and share cultures, and now we have this cross-cultural experiences that are happening, and adds to that preservation, I think. Some of those things might not have been preserved if they kept it to themselves and didn't share it with those other students at the school. So that's a lot of what my great-grandma experienced as well, my great-great-grandma. Another aspect that's important to note is that because she was living on a reservation, her father was really poor. I think her mother had passed away when she was young, or her father had passed away, actually. My bad. Her father had passed away. Her mother was taking care of the kids, and she had no money, basically, so they went a lot of times without food. So my great-grandma Pat actually ended up liking some of the aspects of boarding schools because she could eat food. Like that's how much trauma was going through their minds, is that I have to like this school that makes me like the white man, but at least I can eat some food. 2 meals a day at least. But so there's aspects of it. It's a hard history, and there's a lot of trauma behind it, but also a lot of resiliency. Miigwech.
I'll speak on two things briefly. One, I don't know the history. Like, I don't know if any of my family was in boarding schools. My mother's father passed away when she was 11 years old. He was the tribal member. He was who was native. He was the one connection between me and the rest of my family on that side. So I have no idea any of the history of that side of my family, apart from what I've researched on my own, which is hard. But I know that a lot of my family lived on reservation up until probably midway through the 1900s. And then there were a series of initiatives by the government to get Native families to buy land off reservation, or they gave them land off reservation to kind of break up tribal communities and westernize or modernize the tribal communities at that point, which is another form of trauma, is that parceling out of land and that breaking up of the tribal community. But I assume somewhere along the way that I must have had ancestors that went to the boarding school, and that's a safe assumption to make because it was very widespread. And it's kind of horrible that I can make that assumption. The other thing is a personal experience. So I study music education here at NMU. I'm actually going through a graduate degree in ethnomusicology, which is the study of cultural music. I went into a used bookstore a year ago, and there's a crate full of used music scores on the ground. Seems really off topic, but I promise it's not. And I'm digging through this bucket of old scores, and I find these little music books that are worn and tattered. And on the inside of the pages, I see that it's inscribed that those were the music books that were used at the boarding school in Bad River, which is the next reservation over. And the kids' names that are written inside these books they're like names that I recognize. They're families that I recognize. And these books are, full of patriotic songs, very Western, classical, music. And I was like, this is the music that these kids were studying in the boarding schools. It's not their music. It's not their songs. They weren't allowed to sing their own songs. So it was really hard for me to have this very tangible a westernization of these kids in my hands. And that's how not long ago it is that I was able to find these scores sitting around in a used bookstore. And I can't imagine being in that school and being told, no, you can't sing that song in your language that you've known ever since you were little, but you're going to sing this. You're going to sing this song. It's in English. You need to learn English. But anything else that actually means anything to you, for me, music means a lot to me. It's gotten me through a lot. Specifically, singing on the big drum has been a big part of how I've gotten back connected to my culture. And that was taken away from these kids. And that's part of the reason I've chosen the path that I have, is because music is so important in my life that I want to be part of preserving cultural music traditions, both for my own culture and for other cultures. But that was a tangible remnant of a boarding school that I held in my hands that hurt my heart a little bit.
Holy, that is so wild. Oh my goodness, that's crazy. Especially going through old documents and stuff, and then you see names you recognize, and then it's like, holy, why? That becomes more real. On boarding schools, I didn't know boarding schools were a thing, and this might sound kind of embarrassing now, until I was probably 15. I didn't know they were a thing, honestly. I didn't know that my grandma was in one. My own grandma, who I'm really close with, was in one of these boarding schools for a long time. My great-grandma, my great-great-grandma. I'm learning that now and all the intergenerational trauma that goes with that. It was really hard to hear. We say I wasn't there for this time, but one of the stories that my grandma was telling 'cause she never said that she went to a boarding school. She called it a foster home. And so we just assumed it was a foster home, nothing to it. And my grandma herself was took care of foster kids. And she got these new kids, and they had lice. And she thought, oh, well, we need to put like this powder on them. There's like this white powder that my foster home put on me to like, because they thought I had bugs or something, and they put it on my head. And then she was talking about Severn. And then my mom looked at her and she went, that's not supposed to be put on kids. And my grandma looked at her, and my sister says the way it looked, it was a really broken and sad look. And she fully had to leave, as it was like so traumatic, the thought that happened. And they did that a lot. And that was a scene, if you've ever seen Indian Horse. It's so hard for me to watch that movie, and especially the beginning parts, because one of the first thing they did when I forgot, Saul was taken into the boarding school is they put Severn powder on them. It's a toxic chemical not meant for humans. And then they cut their hair, and then, all that stuff. So it hasn't been that long ago. It's been fairly recent. And healing from all that trauma is very recent. Like I said, like, I'm in a really fortunate position because I'm able to talk about this. My sister, when she was my age, wasn't able to talk about this. We barely even knew that was a thing. My mom, definitely not. Barely even my grandma, definitely not, because she was just getting out of them. So it's really recent, and healing from all that is really recent, but also acknowledging the resiliency it took for me to get where I'm at. Like, I'm a college student. I've been able to buy my own car. I've been able to do these things for myself that previously probably would have been out of the question. Like, how do we get to there? How do we get from where we were at to here? That's crazy resiliency. And I'm really fortunate to have the ancestors that I've had, like my parents and my grandparents, because it's amazing. I can't imagine going through what they've had to go through to get to me, because that's how we got here. They were thinking of me. So
I want to correct something I said quick. I said ivory soap for some reason. I don't know why I said that, but I meant lye soap, that chemical that was put in their mouths. Sorry about that.
All right. Kateri, when I interviewed you, you talked about, was it your grandmother said something about that they expected that you weren't going to be around anymore. Do you remember the context of that, and explain that a little bit more?
So the context with that, there's this picture, and it's of her name is Massa, and she was alive back in the 1800s, and that's like great grandma of mine. And I'm really interested in reading historical texts. I don't know why, and maybe I do know why, but I get really intrigued by it, and I just want to learn more and more and more. Maybe it's because we've been so depraved of all the information in Native history that we've had, that what little has been documented, I seem to gravitate towards. And so I looked into that picture because that's my grandma. I want to know like her full story, and they'll share like a little like paragraph or whatever. So I kind of wanted to know more, and so I started digging into like the artist who drew out the picture of my grandma, and just like, especially for the time, what was going on, the way the paragraph sums up her life story is super hard for me, because at the time where she was like photographed was literally the time they were signing the Treaty of Eye Removal. And the way the paragraph talks about it, it's like, oh, and we visited this log cabin, and we were playing games with this old like Indian chiefess woman, and she made bad bread. It was so funny, and that was it. And it's like, we were signing the Treaty of Our Removal at that time. There's no way that was a great fun time. And so I read more into the artist, and one of the things that he documented while he was going on this whole thing of drawing out these Native people, in his mind, in his world, after like this treaty or whatever, after the expansion of America, there was going to be no Potawatomi people. And so he had to draw out and document every little thing because we were not going to exist anymore. And so the picture of my grandma was really true to life. Like, it has all her regalia and the way her hair looked. And especially for the time, like, there's a lot of propaganda going on. And he acknowledged that. And he goes, I don't want any propaganda. I don't want any of that. He didn't say propaganda, but I want a true to life picture of this Potawatomi woman because there will be no more after this. And I want to make sure we all know. That speaks miles as to what this fellow was doing, drawing out pictures of these Indian people. But that's that tidbit on that.
Thanks for telling his story. So I'm going to, just for a second, play devil's advocate here. And not from my perspective, but when I talk about this issue with people who are not Native, not all people, but some other people, family members, friends, sometimes this is the response that I'll get. When are they going to get over it? You know, that was 100 years ago. When are they going to let it go? And they'll say this about African Americans in slavery. They'll say it about Native Americans. What do you say to those people? When people give you that kind of an answer, just let it go. Let's move on. How do you answer that question? And why is it so hard to let it go? Or why can't you let it go?
I think we've already let go of so much already. We've already lost so much culture. We've already lost so much language. We've lost our families. That this history, as hard as it is and as difficult as it is to talk about, we don't want to be up here talking about this. This isn't what we want to tell you about, believe me. There are much more interesting things that we could tell you about Native culture, but we've lost so much of our history that this, as hard as it is, we need to hold on to this like white-knuckled to remember that it is an accomplishment that we are still here. Every time that I think that I should step away from Native culture because I look white or because I'm not a tribal member, I remember that I can't because all of my family survived to get me to this point so that I can learn what I can of my culture and hold on to what of my culture that I can today. So it's not because we want to. We would much rather forget about colonization and move on with our lives, but that's not an option because we need to hold on to our culture. And right now, what we have of our culture is only what survived through colonization, and it is intricately tied to that process of colonization. If we let these processes go, if we stop talking about these processes, we forget what we've lost. And it's truly lost forever because we're not trying to retain it anymore.
Get over it. That would be nice. No, I didn't think of that one. Didn't think of doing that. Well, I think when people tell me that, I ask them, well, get over it. I think that comes from the thought that colonization ended when we're still in the process of colonization. We're still being colonized to this day. I asked them to tell me, well, when did we stop being traumatized? When did colonization end? Was it in 1854 when we signed that treaty, ceded thousands of acres of land, and we got a few dollars for that? Was that when it ended? Was it 1924 when Indians became citizens of the United States? Was it then? Was it 1976 when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was signed? Was it now when we're still finding bodies to this day at American Indian boarding schools that we haven't found before? If somebody can tell me when the trauma ends, he should definitely let me know, and I'd be happy to start decolonizing and getting over it. So it's still happening today. We're still in a state of colonization. We're still losing culture, language, and history, but we're contributing to the revitalization and resurgence of it as well.
It's such a cop out. Saying get over it is such a cop out. Like, not wanting to me, what it just sounds like is I don't want to even begin to think about all of what that means. That's what it sounds like to me, because it is a lot. And I mean, I wish I didn't have to think about it either. I'm just finding out about it sometimes as these other people have found out about it. Like I said, I was like, 15 when I knew that my own grandmother went to one. I'm just finding out about it too. I mean, it hasn't been that long ago. All the trauma is still some of it's really recent. There was a time when my mother, like, she said something to me, and because we're still healing and stuff, and it was really hurtful. And it's hard to put the words on to why when you're a kid. My sister was there, and she looked at my mom and she was like, "You sound like what the nuns used to say to those kids." And my mom looked at me, and she looked at my sister, and it was just like a moment of like healing, because it was able to put a label on why. It's good to learn and to grow. And if you don't talk about this, there is no growth. Like I said, just putting that label on it, that is why. It was a way of like we can move on. That's like, this is all the emotional turmoil. It's so much emotional turmoil after those schools, because everything was so silenced. All the stuff that happened in those schools were so silenced. Like, the fact that my grandma never got to talk about that is so terrible. It's so terrible. And that went on to her and to my mom. All the emotional turmoil that my mom had, and then to me, it was so silent. So saying get over it is another form of that silencing. And I haven't been told that in a while, ever since I've moved away from like Oklahoma and like my public school experiences. But I think that's probably what I would say now. What a cop out.
Thank you so much for that answer and for all of your answers on that. And I think because there's a lot of discussion right now in the media about critical race theory and these ideas of looking at the past, and much of it is, the criticism of it is just let it go, let's move on, let's not talk about the ugly stuff, let's only talk about the heroes and the great things people have done, but let's not talk about these other things, because it divides us. And I, as a historian, would say, I would think it brings us closer together to talk about these things. But that's the big struggle that seems to be going on in the public sphere right now, is this discussion on this whole idea, and that's why I brought it up. We are about 40 minutes in. I'd like to open this up for questions from the audience. If you have any questions or comments, does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask these three amazing young people? No questions? You want to just hear them talk more? I'm sure they can do that. I know them all. They love to talk. Okay, well, she just raised her hand. Then I'll get back to you, Corinne.
I'm curious to know what brought you to Northern.
I got a full ride. I couldn't have attended college otherwise. I was a valedictorian at my high school, scored really well on tests, and the only way I was getting to college was on a full ride. And I got it, and here I am. I didn't come here because of the Native American Studies program, but I stayed here because of my connections with it. And that is really why I'm continuing into higher education and continuing through my graduate degree, is because of my connection with the Native American Student Association here at the Center for Native American Studies. That's what's pushed me into continuing into ethnomusicology and really retaining my connection with my culture. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, most simply, it was because of the bachelor's degree in Native American Studies is why I came to Northern. Those were my two things when Going into my freshman year I was going to be majoring in Native American Studies, and I was going to be a part of the Native American Student Association. Just seeing the connection to culture and the educated professors here is what made me want to come to Northern.
It's kind of a journey for me, but to wrap it up, because I do have a lab at 3, so I'm going to have to step out after this question. I moved up here because of my sister. My sister moved here to be a language teacher for the Hannibal Indian School, and I fell in love with the area, especially learning like the stories and the history that I have with this place, this being my traditional homeland. I fell in love. I fell in love with all the language and the culture here, and this university is close and it has the Native American center. So I really wanted to come here, and I wanted to be closer to her, and I wanted to be closer to the land and the culture.
Thank you. We do have a question back here.
Hey, Bazile, how are you?
I am good. How are you, Professor Boldman?
I am great.
Awesome.
So we had an interesting, very interesting dialogue in class on Wednesday night. We are doing Iverson snowshoes, as you are aware. And a 20-minute discourse in a statement we want to make became very heated. The students wanted to call Iverson's the original snowshoe. And it went crazy in class because they thought it would be offensive to the native peoples. We would like you to answer, and Yrsa, is that an offensive statement to you?
Whoa. That's cool that they had a discourse about it. It's a good conversation to have. The original snowshoe. So if people aren't familiar with snowshoes, Native Americans have had a larger than what we think sometimes of the things that we've invented. We've invented canoes, we've invented kayaks, sunglasses, snowshoes, rubber, aspirin, are just some of the few things that I can name off of the top of my head that we had a contribution to inventing and knowing of. The original snowshoe. I think that's a super cool name, honestly, when I first think about it. I think it could be seen as appropriation especially if the Iversons' business, which I don't think they are, isn't contributing to Native communities at all and giving back. They're not like recognizing or respecting the people who actually made the original snowshoe. I think if they put those efforts behind it, I would appreciate it. I think it would be super cool to recognize that. With the business at its current state, they should probably think a little more about that. I'm not offended and my feelings aren't hurt right now, and I'm not like emotional about it, but I think there are processes to think of that could make that name more appropriate. And I think that's a super cool name.
What kind of snowshoe is it? Are they traditional snowshoes? Are they traditional snowshoes, like framed? Okay. Okay. I don't know. I like the fact that they're traditional snowshoes and they're calling it the original snowshoe. Honestly, I think that's a little bit of an homage, if anything. Because most people, when they buy snowshoes today, they're buying bear paw snowshoes, which aren't the original snowshoes. They're nothing like traditional snowshoes. So connected with some information about why those snowshoes are made the way they are and those teachings, I think, honestly, I would see that as a little bit of an homage to, yes, this is the original design for a snowshoe. And this is why it works. Because it was used by indigenous peoples for hundreds of years. That would be my take on it, and I think that honestly, from a marketing insight, like that could be something that could build their business a little more if they include that information and that background. I would buy that snowshoe over another snowshoe because it's based in indigenous ingenuity. But then again, you can't use indigenous ingenuity without doing what he said, and actually recognizing and giving back to Indigenous communities.
So we have time for one more question. Well, actually, no, maybe a couple more. Does anybody have any more questions they'd like to ask? Maggie?
Yeah, super cool question, though. Thanks, Professor Bowden.
What would be both of your ideal careers, and how would your Native culture be a part of those careers if you could pick your ideal situation in the future?
So right now I'm going to graduate with a Bachelor's of Science in Native American Studies next semester. Planning to go to graduate school, get my PhD in something relating to Native studies, either sociocultural anthropology, or people have been convincing me to try to go to law school lately. So I want to be a professor. I want to be a teacher. The professors here at NMU have inspired me in how much education matters for both the preservation but also the resurgence of our Native cultures, languages, and the understandings of our history. So that's my dream job, be a professor, and also right now I'm kind of doing some freelance work on the side of doing this educational component, kind of like what I'm doing right now. So that's my dream job, just to talk about who I am all day. I think that would be pretty fun.
So I'm going to be going through a doctorate in ethnomusicology. Most people would think that I was going to be a professor, which honestly, like, that's what I expect to do. But what I would want to do would be to start a nonprofit center for Indigenous musics that includes both communal spaces to make music as well as spaces to record music and things like that. So whether that would be connected to a historical society or a university or something like that, creating spaces for communal music making and being able to record and preserve the musical traditions that are performed in that way. That is really my passion. So I don't know if I'll get there someday, but if you ever hear of a super famous like Center for Indigenous Music, look and see if my name's under it, because that's my goal.
Well, there's an idea for the Whitman Commons. That's not funny, Dan.
Too soon, maybe.
What's that? Too soon.
Too
Yeah,
soon.
That's too soon. That's a great idea. I would love to see that happen at a place like Northern.
The university that I'm planning on attending for my graduate degree houses the nation's first Center for Latin American Music, which was started, I think, in the 40s. And I don't think that there's a center for Indigenous music anywhere in the nation as far as I know of. There's a center for just the studies of First Nations, but that's really broad. Just saying. That's like hundreds of different peoples and entire cultures within that.
Well, it's maybe we can get some of that $90 million they're spending to build one, huh? What do you think? I don't think that's going to happen, but I think it's a great idea. Any other questions, comments, jokes about the Whitman Commons? Well, if not, thank you too, and also Kateri, who had to leave. This is really powerful and illuminating. Next, we're going to have a session on entrepreneurship. I can never say that word here in the UP. But we'll take a break and we'll start back at 3:10 here in this room. Please eat the rest of the cinnamon rolls and things and the coffee. We'd appreciate that.